March 31, 1922, 6 people were murdered with a mattock on an isolated Bavarian farm. The killer locked the bodies in the barn, then lived in the house for 3 days, feeding the animals, eating meals, and sleeping in the beds. When neighbors found the bodies, the killer was gone, and has never been identified. The Hinterkaifeck farm was located in a remote part of Bavaria, Germany, around 70 kilometers north of Munich. The farmstead itself was isolated, with the nearest neighbors several hundred meters away. Surrounded by fields and forests, it was a quiet, peaceful location, a place where one might expect to hear only the sounds of nature. In 1922, there was no electricity on the farm. The family used oil lamps to light their way, and there were no phones or modern conveniences. It was truly isolated from the outside world. The farm was modest in size, consisting of a traditional Bavarian farmhouse, a barn attached to the house, and a machine room between the two. The house, barn, and machine room were all connected, making it easier to move between them. This layout would become critical to the investigation, as it allowed the killer to move freely between the house and barn without raising suspicion. The family that lived on the farm was small but tightly knit. There was Andreas Gruber, the patriarch of the family. A stern private man, Andreas was 63 years old at the time of the murders. He was a widower, having lost his first wife many years earlier. He lived with his second wife, Cecilia, who was 72. Andreas was known locally, but he kept to himself and was often described as having a difficult personality, particularly when it came to his family. Victoria Gabriel, their 35-year-old daughter, also lived on the farm. A widow herself, Victoria had lost her husband, Karl Gabriel. During World War I, she helped run the household and the farm alongside her father and stepmother. Victoria had 2 children, Cecilia, a 7-year-old schoolgirl, and Joseph, a 2-year-old toddler born after her husband's death. There were rumors in the village about Joseph's parentage, with some speculating that Andreas might have been involved with Victoria in an incestuous relationship. However, these rumors were never proven, and the whispers in the village remained just that, whispers. Finally, there was Maria Baumgartner, a 44-year-old woman who had just started her first day of work as the farm's maid. Her tragic timing would come to define the horrific events that followed. 6 months earlier, the previous maid had quit, claiming that she heard footsteps in the attic at night. She described feeling uneasy and scared, and when Andreas dismissed her concerns, she left the job. Maria, however, accepted the position despite these warnings, unaware that her first day would be her last. As we dive deeper into this case, we find that there were signs, strange events that took place before the murders, events that were overlooked or dismissed. About 6 months before the murders, the previous maid had quit suddenly. She told Andreas that she heard footsteps in the attic at night, the sounds of someone moving around above her room. Andreas, ever the skeptic, dismissed her concerns and continued his work on the farm. The maid, frightened by these strange noises, left immediately, and the family managed without household help for several months. In the days leading up to the murders, Andreas noticed several disturbing things. One of the most troubling was the discovery of footprints in the snow. A few days before March 31st, Andreas found tracks in the snow leading from the forest to the farm. The tracks came right up to the house, but there were no tracks leading away. It was as though someone had walked to the farm and simply stayed, perhaps disappeared. Andreas, troubled by this discovery, only shared this information with a neighbor. Then, there was the strange discovery of a Munich newspaper that Andreas found on his property. He didn't subscribe to that paper, and yet it had somehow ended up on his land. This was a clear sign that a stranger had been on the property, or at the very least, someone had been close by. Along with this, Andreas noticed that the lock on the tool shed had been tampered with. Someone had tried to break in, or perhaps had already done so. Items inside the shed may have been disturbed. Finally, Andreas himself began hearing noises coming from the attic, the same noises that had frightened the previous maid. He investigated, but when he checked the attic, he found nothing. However, the noises continued on different nights, leading him to believe that someone was accessing the attic somehow. Andreas shared his concerns with his neighbor, Lawrence Schlittenbauer, about the footprints and the strange happenings. He expressed that he felt like someone was watching the farm, but he didn't report these incidents to the police. Some theorize that Andreas was a private man who preferred to handle things himself, while others suggest that he had secrets he didn't want to expose to the authorities. Despite these warnings, the family remained on the farm. They hired Maria as the new maid, and on March 31st, she started her first day of work. Yet, even with all the signs pointing to danger, they chose not to flee, not to seek help. Instead, they carried on as if everything were normal, a decision that would ultimately cost them their lives. The evening of March 31st, 1922 would become one of the darkest nights in criminal history. Between 7 and 9 p.m., the murders took place. The weapon used was a mattock, a farming tool, similar to a pickaxe, with a heavy head and a sharp blade on one side. The tool was kept in the barn, and it was the killer's weapon of choice. The first victims, Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia, were lured to the barn that evening, likely to check on the animals or investigate the strange noise they had heard earlier. The killer, waiting in the barn, hid in the shadows, prepared to strike. Andreas was the first to be attacked, struck multiple times in the head. Cecilia, the elderly woman, was also struck multiple times, killing her instantly. Victoria was next, attacked and killed. But it was young Cecilia, only 7 years old, whose death remains the most disturbing. Autopsy reports revealed that she survived the initial attack. Her hair was ripped from her head in clumps as she fought back, but eventually she succumbed to her wounds and blood loss, lying in agony for hours in the barn. The killer left her there, unaware or uncaring that she was still alive when he moved on to the house. In the house, the killer found 2-year-old Joseph sleeping in his bed. The toddler was killed with the same matic. The maid, Maria, was also found in her room, murdered on her first day of work. Her body was left in the house, just as Joseph's was. 6 people murdered in one night. 4 in the barn, 2 in the house, all killed with the same weapon. Blunt force trauma to the head, brutal, close-range murders. The killer must have been covered in blood. What makes this case so chilling isn't just the brutality of the murders, it's what the killer did afterward. Instead of fleeing, the killer stayed in the house for days. For 3 days, the killer continued the family's routines. The animals were fed regularly. The cows were milked, and the chickens were cared for. Neighbors noticed that the animals seemed fine, well-fed, and properly tended to. Someone was in the house, living as though everything were normal. The killer ate the family's food, preparing meals in the kitchen, using the bread, the dishes. Some were left washed, others untouched. Fires were lit in the stove, keeping the house warm. Neighbors saw smoke coming from the chimney, and oil lamps were used at night. Someone was walking through the house, room to room, with a lamp in hand. Maria's body was even moved, her corpse repositioned by the killer. This disturbing detail suggests that the killer was interacting with the bodies, moving them as though they were part of the routine. The killer didn't seem to fear being caught. They maintained a calm, methodical presence in the house, even sleeping in the family's beds and walking through the rooms. No remorse, no fear, just cold indifference. The killer remained for days, as if there were no rush, as if they owned the place. No one was there to stop them, and then, on April 4th, they vanished. No trace was left behind, no signs of their departure. They simply disappeared, leaving the farm as they found it. Only now, 6 bodies lay scattered in the house and barn. The discovery of the bodies came on April 4th, 1922. Cecilia had missed school on the 3rd and 4th, raising concern among the teachers. The neighbors, who had grown suspicious of the smoke from the chimney and the lack of activity on the farm, began to investigate. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor, went to the farm with a small group. They knocked on the door but received no answer. The house was locked, and everything seemed normal inside, but no one was visible. Schlittenbauer decided to force entry, and that's when the bodies were discovered. Inside the house, Maria and Joseph's bodies were found in their respective rooms. The blood was evident, and the violence was unmistakable. The search continued, and the barn was unlocked. There they found the 4 bodies, Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and young Cecilia, all covered with hay. The horror of the scene was unimaginable. Young Cecilia's hands were clutched with clumps of her own hair, evidence that she had struggled, had fought for her life in those final moments. The investigation began immediately. Over 100 people were questioned, and several suspects emerged, including Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who had found the bodies. He was rumored to be Joseph's biological father, which led some to speculate about a motive involving incest. There was also the theory that Victoria's supposed dead husband, Karl Gabriel, had faked his death during the war and returned only to find his wife in a scandalous situation. Finally, there were rumors of a traveling vagrant or stranger who might have been stalking the farm for weeks. The footprints in the snow and the noises from the attic seemed to suggest an outsider was involved. Despite these theories, the investigation stalled. No forensic evidence was available, as the technology of the time was limited. The lack of fingerprints, DNA, and useful evidence made it impossible to identify the killer. The case went cold, and no one was ever charged. The farm's fate was sealed. It was sold, but the new owners couldn't live there. The horror of the murders hung over the property, and the buildings were eventually demolished. A memorial was erected at the site to remember the victims, but the case remained unsolved. In the years since, the case has been reopened several times, most notably in the 1950s and again in 2007, when students and police re-examined the evidence. Facial reconstructions were made using the skulls of the victims, but no new leads emerged. Theories continue to swirl, but no one has been able to provide a definitive answer. Some suggest that the killer was a family member or close associate who knew the layout of the farm. Others speculate that it was a stranger or vagrant who targeted the farm. Some even wonder if Victoria's dead husband was involved. What's clear is that the truth will likely never be known. 6 people murdered. A 7-year-old girl who suffered for hours before dying, a maid on her first day of work, a toddler, and a killer who lived with their bodies, fed their animals, ate their food, and walked away. Hinterkaifeck. March 31st, 1922, Germany's darkest unsolved mystery. The farm is gone. The evidence is gone. The witnesses are gone, but the horror remains. And somewhere, the killer's identity died with them. One of history's most disturbing murders. Forever unsolved.